Hey, Eddie. Thank you for joining me for this afternoon. This is an important time when last night I received a call from the CMS director advising me that these rules would be coming out today. And then, as indicated, the rules from CMS and the Biden administration, as well as the OSHA rules, were issued today in terms of vaccine requirements of employees. I have conferred with our Arkansas Attorney General, Leslie Rutledge. I have met with my cabinet that's impacted by this, and I'm joined by Secretary Preston of the Department of Commerce, and of course Secretary Gillespie of the Department of Human Services, and then Department of Health is impacted as well, and our Chief of Staff, Renee, is with us today. And it really impacts not just the employers in this state, but also state employees as well, and I want to go through that a little bit. So the purpose, I want to cover a little bit of my response to the Biden administration's actions. I want to talk about more in detail what these rules mean for our employers, but also for our state agencies, and then some of the response that we want to have from this. And as I indicated today, the Biden administration followed through with its promise to impose federal vaccine mandates on businesses, hospitals, and nursing homes. This is the first time in the history of our country that a federal mandate has been issued that impacts broad swaths of the American population. I oppose these mandates on the freedom that businesses should have to run their workplace. Businesses should have the freedom to make their own decision, whether they should have the decision to require vaccines in their workplace or for the decision not to have vaccine requirements in their workplace. That is the freedom that businesses and those that have employees should have. Businesses, very importantly, should have the freedom to decide for themselves what is the best for their workplace and the health of their workers and customers. The results of these mandates are very significant. The result of these mandates is to create hardship on people, businesses, and our efforts to get people back to work. And let me illustrate it just from two standpoints. Today I was in Jonesboro, and we opened up a new business, expansion of a business. And I talked to the CEO and I said, these mandates have just now come down. What's going to be your response to it? And he said, well, in this environment where we're trying to get employees, you can't mandate the vaccine, so we have to provide an alternative for testing, which is an expense to them. It's overhead, but they're willing to do that for their workplace, but they don't want to put the mandate in place. Now, the other response I would give is, or illustration, is our human development centers here in Arkansas. And we have multiple human development centers from Arkadelphia, Boonville, Conway, Jonesboro, Warren, and in each of these, they're covered by the mandate because they receive Medicaid and Medicare funding, Medicaid funding. And in each of these places that we have, on average, probably a 55% vaccination rate among the employees. That means 45% of the employees of our human development centers, their jobs are at risk. These are employees in which we have high turnover. We have a hard time keeping our workplace and our professionals there that they can do the work that is needed for the residents. And so this makes the job much more difficult. It's going to potentially jeopardize the well-being of those centers if we can't keep the staff in place that we need. We're trying to put people back to work, and this is going to make it more difficult to accomplish that goal. We want to put people back to work and not discourage them from work and give them a reason to drop out of the workforce. Now let me just go through some of these rules themselves. First, let me start with the OSHA rules. These are emergency temporary rules that have come out, 490 pages of these rules, and they require all employers with 100 or more employees to ensure the employees are vaccinated or get tested on a weekly basis. And that's an important distinction, that the employers, the private sector employers, can have a testing alternative. That same testing alternative is not allowed under the very strict mandate that is issued by CMS. So there's a difference there, and so our employees at the development centers do not have the option right now of being tested if they opt out of the vaccine. And going back to the OSHA rules that applies to the private sector businesses with 100 or more employees, it does not apply to state and local governments. This is important. State and local governments and school districts do not have to comply with the OSHA rules. And so they're exempt from that, and that's important for the public to know. And of course, it's very inclusive when it says all employees. This can be those that work in different locations. It could be part-time employees, and so it's very comprehensive. It's required that the workers have paid time off for the vaccine, which is of course reasonable, and all of this has to be completed in terms of compliance with the first and second dose by January 4th under the OSHA rules. An employee who is unable to produce acceptable proof of vaccination has to provide a signed and dated attestation of their vaccination status. An employee who knowingly provides false information is subject not to civil penalties but to criminal penalties. And so this is a mandate for employers that puts them in a real box in the sense that the federal mandate is there, but it's actually in conflict with what the state law that was recently passed. And their testing that is an option for employees in the workplace is very clearly defined as very restrictive tests in which a specimen are processed in a lab, or they can utilize over-the-counter test, point-of-care test, but the employer must be engaged in the specimen collection and processing. And so it's much more restrictive than what the state had designed as a testing alternative. Those are just a few of the things of the OSHA rules. It does allow 30 days in comments that I'll come back to. And now if we look at the CMS rule, and we do have this on the graphic, and Shaylin, could you go get a copy of the 3-ring binder on the rules, please, on my desk? So the CMS rules is 214 pages. It goes to effect on November 5, 2021. It applies to all staff of CMS regulated healthcare entities which have to be vaccinated by January 4. It includes on-site staff at the facility, including employees, licensed practitioners, students, trainees, volunteers, and contractors. It does not include individuals who are 100% working remote. So that's the basic of the rule. The only exceptions allowed under the rule are medical and religious. As you can see, they do not allow an exception for testing alternatives. Facilities cannot use masking and testing in lieu of vaccination. And on the CMS rules, we have an opportunity to give comment. I just wanted everybody to see the rules that we got and the length of these rules that we were trying to digest through. But we have 60 days to provide comments for the rules. And that is an important opportunity for us in the state to influence the direction. Let me finally articulate some action items that we want to follow up on. First of all, we intend to fight the federal mandate that has been passed down. We'll fight it in a couple different directions. First of all, as I spoke with the Attorney General, we will support the litigation effort in challenging the OSHA rules that she anticipates filing shortly. We will provide any necessary support for that. In terms of the challenge to the CMS rules, that we will continue to look at as to whether there's an effective legal challenge that we can pursue, and we will be developing our strategies on that in consultation with the Attorney General. I've asked my agency directors and my department secretaries, very importantly, to prepare comments within the next 60 days to the proposed rules. These are emergency rules that can be adjusted. We want to make a strong case, particularly that we can have a testing alternative for our employees. We don't want to lose these employees. We want to be able to keep our workforce for the good of our residents in these care facilities. And so that is just one of the example of the comments that we want to make to influence the direction of these rules as we continue to oppose them in terms of the litigation that might be pursued. With that, there's a lot more here, but let me see if there's any questions you might have.
You're an attorney. What's the likelihood of the state prevailing on legal challenges to these rules?
Well, first of all, in terms of the OSHA rules, I think there's a significant constitutional challenge. Again, this is the first time in history that the federal government has come in and usurped the authority of the states in a public health matter, has dictated to our businesses at a very small business level that they have to incur these costs, risk losing employees, and in a time of supply shortages, this is the last thing we need to do, is to lose workers and drivers for trucking companies that are so critical to having the supplies that we need in society today and to keep our economy moving. So I believe there's a very significant constitutional challenge. The state can bring that. I think it's very significant if employers bring that challenge as well, which I would expect may happen down the road. And so that's one we'll watch very closely and probably most significantly impacts the economy in Arkansas. The second challenge would be separately on the CMS rules. That is more difficult because they have the purse string that's attached to that, and it can jeopardize funding. They have agreements with us, and so that's something that will be going to have to look at more closely and to consult again with the Attorney General and to see if there's any good avenue to challenge it legally and constitutionally. If not, we're going to try to influence it in terms of commenting on the rules and providing that testing alternative.
So if an employer calls you and says, hey, I'm trying to figure out whether to thumb my nose at the federal government or comply, what's your advice?
Now go through that again, Mike. You said if an employee calls?
An employer calls you and says, hey, should I just not comply and thumb my nose at the federal government, or should I comply? What is your advice?
My advice would be to talk to their legal counsel. They should talk to their attorney, some really employment experts on that. And this is what I've tried to avoid is whenever we pass state legislation that puts requirements on our businesses to provide testing alternatives, and we define it one way, and then the federal government comes in and defines it another way, we've put our businesses in a catch-22. You're going to be violating somebody's law here. And obviously, historically, the federal law has been supreme, but if there's an unconstitutional overreach, then that's a different question, and I believe that's the area that we're in now. I would suspect that many employers, in talking to their legal counsel, will say, let's wait and see. We can see if there's going to be some effective injunctions that might be issued by the court that might forestall them putting into place these requirements, but we'll see.
Is the Human Development Centers one of those parts of DHS that is severely understaffed because of the job market? Is that?
Yes, Cindy, why don't you come and talk about what you see as the impact on the Human Development Centers, and we'll come right here.
Be happy to. Yes, it is. The Human Development Centers are impacted by this, the Arkansas State Hospital, as well as the Arkansas Health Center, which is the nursing home down in Haskell. We have over 3,000 employees that are affected through this mandate. And in all situations, at all of these facilities, we are, at this point, very much struggling with staff and down staff. At the Human Development Centers alone, we're down about 700 staff. So the staff that are there are working overtime, they are working weekends, they are working very long hours. And so losing more staff becomes a health and safety issue.
So what are you telling those employees today?
Today, we are finding our way through these rules that have just dropped, like every other healthcare provider and employer, and trying to understand what they mean and how. We're on a call with about 10,000 other providers with CMS today to learn a little bit more, and we're waiting on more guidance from them.
Tell them to go get vaccinated?
We have been working with our employees since the vaccines came out, the ones at the facilities, encouraging them, answering their questions, providing on-site vaccination clinics. But we've been working with them to give them information so that they can make their own choices.
Have you guys had any employees that have quit because of the mandate so far?
No, because the mandate just got announced this morning and doesn't actually take effect in that way until January 4th of 2022.
Let me jump. Thank you, Cindy, and let me emphasize that we continue to encourage vaccination of our employees. We're very proud of the fact that our state employees are at, I believe, a 66% vaccination rate, but we're doing that through education and by providing information, and we've seen these mandates as being counterproductive. Yes, ma'am.
With Arkansas's law that was passed this year for employers to opt out of federal vaccine mandates, it seems like the legislature prepared for something like this. So what happens when next year comes and Arkansas law is put into place and we have this federal mandate?
That's a good point, that the law that was passed does not go into effect until January. But at that time, the law is in conflict with what is the current federal mandates. What happens? That's something that a court would have to determine. Generally speaking, federal law trumps state law, but here again, I think there'll be some serious constitutional challenges to it, and that does give some time to sort through that before the state law actually goes into effect.
And you kind of touched on this, but we have big companies like Walmart and Tyson here, and when we talk about the supply chain issue and worker shortage, I mean, have you spoken to any of these big companies or even local companies about how they're impacted, what they want out of this?
I have, and first of all, again, we have some major companies in Arkansas that do have vaccine requirements for very good reasons, and so I support their choice to have a vaccine requirement for their employees. But at the same time, we shouldn't require it for every employer. They need to make their own decision based upon the uniqueness of their workplace and the public health requirements. But yes, and I'll let Secretary Preston comment more about the supply chain issues, but because I know he's talked to some employers as well. The ones I've talked to are very concerned about this. There's extraordinary worker shortage right now, and this is going to make the shortage more difficult and more challenging, because in this environment, an employee who doesn't want to comply with the mandate can go find a job anywhere. And there's other jobs that are available that might be exempt from that mandate because there are fewer than 100 employees. Mike, did you have anything?
Governor, I echo those comments. I think the supply chain is going to continue to be disrupted, and even more so because of this. I think you brought up Tyson's a good example. They did that, their mandate independently of the federal government or anyone else, and they're at a 92% implementation rate in their company. So I think that speaks to a business knowing their employees, knowing their workforce better than the federal government coming in and trying to tell them what to do. But on the other side of it, those ones that, you know, are 100 or bigger, it's going to impact the supply chain, as the governor mentioned, the trucking and the shipping industry. So many are going to be impacted, and the list goes down and down. But the aggregate of 100 employees, that's aggregate of one company. So if you think of a small restaurant who might have multiple locations, well, total they're at 100. So that could cause an employee there to leave and go into another field or another restaurant, again, diminishing their workforce. So it's going to be a significant impact on small businesses and large businesses.
Yes.
When you were talking about purse strings, were you talking about earlier, were you talking about the government holding the purse strings of OSHA holding the purse strings for the government, or what were you specifically?
No, thank you. No, when I referenced the federal government holding the purse strings, I'm speaking of their CMS, which are their Medicaid requirements. And so just on that side of the equation with the rules, they indicate that if you do not comply, then they can withhold Medicaid funding. They could cut you off as a provider. And so obviously that would have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of impact here in the state of Arkansas. They do say that that's their last resort, and they would look at penalties and other assessments as penalties first. But regardless, whenever you've got money flowing from the federal government for Medicaid and Medicare, that would be a huge loss to the state that you do not want to have happen whenever you're talking about the most vulnerable of our citizens, whether they're in a human development center or whether they're in some other care capacity.
Would you consider that a form of extortion from the U.S. government?
Well, it's certainly
Why or nothing?
in that whenever you're looking at that kind of leverage, it is an unequal partnership, and that they're using that over us to get compliance. The courts would have to determine whether that's a fair use of federal authority or not. Obviously, we object to it. We've always said that we ought to have more flexibility versus less flexibility in administering these programs because it's our citizens that are at risk. Thank you all very much for your time today.